Quenta Silmarillion of Túrin Turambar. Rian, daughter of Beleg, was the wife of Tuor, son of Galdor, and she was wedded to him 2 months before he went with Húrin, his brother, to the Nirnaeth Arnoediad. When no tidings came of her lord, she fled into the wild, but she was aided by the grey elves of Mithrim, and when her son, Tuor, was born, they fostered him. Then Rian departed from Hithlum, and going to the Haud en Degin, she laid herself down upon it and died. Morwen, daughter of Baragund, was the wife of Húrin, lord of Dorlomin, and their son was Turin, who was born in the year that Beren Erchamion came upon Luthien in the forest of Neldoreth. A daughter they had also, who was called Lailaith, which is laughter, and she was beloved by Turin, her brother. But when she was 3 years old, there came a pestilence to Hithlum, born on an evil wind out of Angband, and she died. Now, after the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, Morwen abode still in Dorlomin, for Turin was but 8 years old, and she was again with child. Those days were evil, for the Easterlings that came into Hithlum despised the remnant of the people of Hador, and they oppressed them, and took their lands and their goods, and enslaved their children. But so great was the beauty and majesty of the Lady of Dorlomin that the Easterlings were afraid, and dared not to lay hands upon her or her household. And they whispered among themselves, saying that she was perilous, and a witch skilled in magic and in league with the elves. Yet she was no poor, and without aid, save that she was succoured secretly by a kinswoman of Húrin, named Ivrin, whom Brother, an Easterling, had taken as his wife, and Morwen feared greatly that Turin would be taken from her and enslaved. Therefore it came into her heart to send him away in secret, and to beg King Thingol to harbour him, for Beren, son of Barahir, was her father's kinsman, and he had been moreover a friend of Húrin ere evil befell. Therefore, in the autumn of the year of lamentation, Morwen sent Turin forth over the mountains with 2 aged servants, bidding them find entry, if they could, into the kingdom of Doriath. Thus was the fate of Turin woven, which is foretold in that lay that is called Narn Ihin Húrin, the tale of the children of Húrin, and is the longest of all the lays that speak of those days. Here that tale is told in brief, for it is woven with the fate of the Silmarils and of the elves, and it is called the Tale of Grief, for it is sorrowful, and in it are revealed most evil works of Morgoth Bauglir. In the first beginning of the year, Morwen gave birth to her child, the daughter of Húrin, and she named her Nienor, which is mourning. But Turin and his companions, passing through great perils, came at last to the borders of Doriath, and there they were found by Beleg Strongbow, chief of the march wardens of King Thingol, who led them to Menegroth. Then Thingol received Turin and took him even to his own fostering, in honor of Húrin the Steadfast, for Thingol's mood was changed towards the house of the Elfriends. Thereafter, messengers went north to Hithlum, bidding Morwen leave Dor-lómin and return with them to Doriath. But still she would not leave the house in which she had dwelt with Húrin. And when the elves departed, she sent with them the dragon helm of Dor-lómin, greatest of the heirlooms of the house of Hador. Turin grew fair and strong in Doriath, but he was marked with sorrow. For 9 years he dwelt in Thingol's halls, and during that time his grief grew less. For messengers went at times to Hithlum, and returning they brought better tidings of Morwen and Nienor. But there came a day when the messengers did not return out of the north, and Thingol would send no more. Then Turin was filled with fear for his mother and sister, and in grimness of heart he went before the king and asked for mail and sword, and he put on the dragon helm of Dor-lómin and went out to battle on the marches of Doriath, and became the companion in arms of Beleg Cuthalion. And when 3 years had passed, Turin returned again to Menegroth, but he came from the wild, and was unkempt, and his gear and garments were way-worn. Now one there was in Doriath of the people of the Nundle, high in the councils of the king. Cyrus was his name. He had long begrudged to Turin the honor he received as Thingol's foster son, and seated opposite to him at the board he taunted him, saying, "If the men of Hithlum are so wild and fell, of what sort are the women of that land? Do they run like deer clad only in their hair?" Then Turin, in great anger, took up a drinking vessel and cast it at Cyrus, and he was grievously hurt. On the next day, Cyrus waylaid Turin as he set out from Menegroth to return to the marshes. But Turin overcame him and set him to run naked as a hunted beast through the woods. Then Cyrus, fleeing in terror before him, fell into the chasm of a stream, and his body was broken on a great rock in the water. But others coming saw what was done, and Mablung was among them, and he bade Turin return with him to Menegroth, and abide the judgment of the king, seeking his pardon. But Turin, deeming himself now an outlaw, and fearing to be held captive, refused Mablung's bidding, and turned swiftly away, and passing through the girdle of Melian, he came into the woods west of Sirion. There he joined himself to a band of such houseless and desperate men as could be found in those evil days lurking in the wild, and their hands were turned against all who came in their path, elves and men and orcs. But when all that had befallen was told and searched out before Thingol, the king pardoned Turin, holding him wronged. In that time Beleg Strongbow returned from the north marshes and came to Menegroth, seeking him. And Thingol spoke to Beleg, saying,
I grieve, Cuthalion, for I took Húrin's son as my son, and so he shall remain, unless Húrin himself should return out of the shadows to claim his own. I would not have any say that Turin was driven forth unjustly into the wild, and gladly would I welcome him back, for I loved him well.
And Beleg answered,
I will seek Turin until I find him, and I will bring him back to Menegroth if I can, for I love him also.
Then Beleg departed from Menegroth, and far across Beleriand he sought in vain for tidings of Turin through many perils. But Turin abode long among the outlaws, and became their captain, and he named himself Nathan the Wronged. Very warily they dwelt in the wooded lands south of Teiglin, but when a year had passed since Turin fled from Doriath, Beleg came upon their lair by night. It chanced that at that time Turin was gone from the camp, and the outlaws seized Beleg and bound him and treated him cruelly, for they feared him as a spy of the king of Doriath. But Turin returning and seeing what was done, was stricken with remorse for all their evil and lawless deeds, and he released Beleg, and they renewed their friendship, and Turin forswore thenceforward war or plunder against all save the servants of Angband. Then Beleg told Turin of King Thingol's pardon, and he sought to persuade him by all means that he might to return with him to Doriath, saying that there was great need of his strength and valor on the north marshes of the realm.
Of late the orcs have found a way down out of Túrin of Húrin, he said. They have made a road through the pass of Anak. I do not remember it, said Turin. Never did we go so far from the borders, said Beleg, but you have seen the peaks of the Chrysaegrim far off, and to the east the dark walls of the Gorgoroth. Anak lies between, above the high springs of Mindeb, a hard and dangerous road, yet many come by it now, and Dimbar, which used to be in peace, is falling under the Black Hand, and the men of Betrayal are troubled. We are needed there."
But in the pride of his heart, Turin refused the pardon of the king, and the words of Beleg were of no avail to change his mood. And he, for his part, urged Beleg to remain with him in the lands west of Sidon. But that Beleg would not do, and he said,
"Hard you are, Turin, and stubborn. Now the turn is mine. If you wish indeed to have the strong bow beside you, look for me in Dimbar, for thither I shall return."
On the next day, Beleg set out, and Turin went with him a bowshot from the camp, but he said nothing.
"Is it farewell then, son of Húrin?"
said Beleg. Then Turin looked out westward, and he saw far off the great height of Amon Rud, and unwitting of what lay before him, he answered,
"You have said, 'Seek me in Dimbar,' but I say, 'Seek for me on Amon Rud.' Else this is our last farewell."
Then they parted in friendship, yet in sadness. Now Beleg returned to the 1,000 caves, and coming before Thingol and Melian, he told them of all that had befallen, save only of his evil handling by Turin's companions. Then Thingol sighed, and he said,
"What more would Turin have me do?" "Give me leave, Lord," said Beleg, "and I will guard him and guide him as I may. Then no man shall say that elven words are lightly spoken. Nor would I wish to see so great a good run to nothing in the wild."
Then Thingol gave Beleg leave to do as he would, and he said,
"Beleg Cuthalion, for many deeds you have earned my thanks, but not the least is the finding of my foster son. At this parting ask for any gift, and I will not deny it to you."
"I ask then for a sword of worth," said Beleg,
"for the orcs come now too thick and close for a bow only, and such blade as I have is no match for their armor. Choose from all that I have,"
said Thingol,
"save only Araneruth, my own."
Then Beleg chose Anglachel, and that was a sword of great worth, and it was so named because it was made of iron that fell from heaven as a blazing star. It would cleave all earth-delved iron. One other sword only in Middle-earth was like to it. That sword does not enter into this tale, though it was made of the same ore by the same smith, and that smith was Eol, the dog elf, who took Dread-Helm, Turgon's sister, to wife. He gave Anglachel to Thingol as fee, which he begrudged, for leave to dwell in Non-Elmoth, but its mate Anguriel he kept, until it was stolen from him by Maeglin, his son. But as Thingol turned the hilt of Anglachel towards Beleg, Melian looked at the blade, and she said, "There is malice in this sword. The dark heart of the smith still dwells in it. It will not love the hand it serves, neither will it abide with you long."
"Nonetheless, I will wield it while I may," said Beleg.
"Another gift I will give to you, Cuthalion," said Melian. "That shall be your help in the wild, and the help also of those whom you choose." And she gave him store of lembas, the wakebread of the elves, wrapped in leaves of silver, and the threads that bound it were sealed at the knots with the seal of the queen, a wafer of white wax shaped as a single flower of Tilperion. For according to the customs of the Eldalie, the keeping and giving of lembas belonged to the queen alone. In nothing did Melian show greater favor to Turin than in this gift, for the elder had never before allowed men to use his waybread, and seldom did so again. Then Beleg departed with these gifts from Menegroth and went back to the north marshes, where he had his lodges and many friends. Then in Dimbar the orcs were driven back, and Anglachel rejoiced to be unsheathed. But when the winter came and war was stilled, suddenly his companions missed Beleg, and he returned to them no more. Now, when Beleg parted from the outlaws and returned into Doriath, Turin led them away westward out of Sidion's vale, for they grew weary of their life without rest, ever watchful and in fear of pursuit, and they sought for a safer lair. And it chanced at a time of evening that they came upon 3 dwarves who fled before them. But one that lagged behind was seized and thrown down, and a man out of the company took his bow and let fly an arrow at the others as they vanished in the dusk. Now the dwarf that they had taken was named Mim, and he pleaded for his life before Turin and offered as ransom to lead them to his hidden halls, which none might find without his aid. Then Turin pitied Mim and spared him, and he said,
"Where is your house?"
Then Mim answered,
"High above the lands lies the house of Mim. Upon the great hill Amon Rud is that hill called now, since the elves changed all the names."
Then Turin was silent, and he looked long upon the dwarf, and at last he said, "You shall bring us to that place." On the next day they set out thither, following Mim to Amon Rud. Now that hill stood upon the edge of the moorlands that rose between the vales of Sirion and Narok, and high above the stony heath it reared its crown. But its steep grey head was bare, save for the red Ceregon that mantled the stone. And as the men of Turin's band drew near, the sun westering broke through the clouds, and fell upon the crown, and the Cirigon was all in flower. Then one among them said,
"There is blood on the hilltop."
But Mime led them by secret paths up the steep slopes of Amon Rud, and at the mouth of his cave he bowed to Turin, saying,
"Enter into Bar en Danwed, the house of ransom, for so it shall be called."
And now there came another dwarf, bearing light to greet him, and they spoke together and passed swiftly down into the darkness of the cave. But Turin followed after, and came at length to a chamber far within, lit by dim lamps hanging upon chains. There he found Mime kneeling at a stone couch beside the wall, and he tore his beard and wailed, crying one name unceasingly, and on the couch there lay a third. But Turin, entering, stood beside Mime and offered him aid. Then Mime looked upon him and said,
"You can give no aid, for this is Kim, my son, and he is dead, pierced by an arrow. He died at sunset. Ibun, my son, has told me."
Then pity rose in Turin's heart, and he said to Mime,
"Alas, I would recall that shaft if I could. Now Barin Danwed, this house shall be called in truth, and if ever I come to any wealth, I will pay you a ransom of gold for your son in token of sorrow, though it gladden your heart no more."
Then Mime rose and looked long at Turin.
"I hear you,"
he said.
"You speak like a dwarf lord of old, and at that I marvel. Now my heart is cooled, though it is not glad, and in this house you may dwell if you will, for I will pay my ransom."
So began the abiding of Turin in the hidden house of Mime upon Amon Rud, and he walked on the green sward upon the mouth of the cave, and looked out east and west and north. Northward he looked, and descried the forest of Betrayal climbing green about Amon Obel in its midst, and thither his eyes were drawn ever again, he knew not why, for his heart was set rather to the northwest, where league upon league away on the skirts of the sky it seemed to him that he could glimpse the mountains of shadow, the walls of his home. But at evening Turin looked west into the sunset, as the sun rode down red into the hazes above the distant coasts, and the vale of Narok lay deep in the shadows between. In the time that followed, Turin spoke much with Mime, and sitting with him alone, he listened to his lore and the tale of his life. For Mime came of dwarfs that were banished in ancient days from the great dwarf cities of the east, and long before the return of Morgoth they wandered westward into Beleriand. But they became diminished in stature and in smithcraft, and they took to lives of stealth, walking with bowed shoulders and furtive steps. before the dwarves of Nogrod and Belegost came west over the mountains, the elves of Beleriand knew not what these others were, and they hunted them and slew them. But afterwards they let them alone, and they were called Noegith Nibin, the petty dwarves, in the Sindarin tongue. They loved none but themselves, and if they feared and hated the orcs, they hated the Eldar no less, and the exiles most of all. For the Noldor, they said, had stolen their lands and their homes. Long ere King Finrod Filigund came over the sea, the caves of Nargothrond were discovered by them, and by them its delving was begun, and beneath the crown of Amon Rud, the bold hill, the slow hands of the petty dwarves had bored and deepened the caves through the long years that they dwelt there, untroubled by the grey elves of the woods. But now at last they had dwindled and died out of Middle-earth, all save Mime and his 2 sons. And Mime was old, even in the reckoning of dwarves, old and forgotten. And in his halls the smithies were idle, and the axes rusted, and their name was remembered only in ancient tales of Doriath and Nargothrond. But when the year drew on to midwinter, snow came down from the north heavier than they had known it in the river vales, and Amon Rud was covered deep, and they said that the winters worsened in Beleriand as the power of Angband grew. Then only the hardiest dead stir abroad, and some fell sick, and all were pinched with hunger. But in the dim dusk of a winter's day, there appeared suddenly among them a man, as it seemed, of great bulk and girth, cloaked and hooded in white, and he walked up to the fire without a word. And when men sprang up in fear, he laughed and threw back his hood, and beneath his wide cloak he bore a great pack, and in the light of the fire Turin looked again on the face of Beleg Cuthalion. Thus Beleg returned once more to Turin, and their meeting was glad, and with him he brought out of Dimbar the dragon helm of Dorlomin, thinking that it might lift Turin's thought again above his life in the wilderness as the leader of a petty company. But still Turin would not return to Doriath, and Beleg, yielding to his love against his wisdom, remained with him and did not depart, and in that time he labored much for the good of Turin's company. Those that were hurt or sick he tended, and gave to them the lembas of Melian, and they were quickly healed, for though the grey elves were less in skill and knowledge than the exiles from Valinor, in the ways of the life of Middle-earth they had a wisdom beyond the reach of men. And because Beleg was strong and enduring, far-sighted in mind as in eye, he came to be held in honor among the outlaws, But the hatred of Mim for the elf that had come into Bar en Danwed grew ever greater, and he sat with Ibun, his son, in the deepest shadows of his house, speaking to none. But Turin paid no little heed to the dwarf, and when winter passed and spring came, they had sterner work to do. Who knows now the counsels of Morgoth? Who can measure the reach of his thought? Who had been Melkor, mighty upon the Ainur of the great song, and sat now a dark lord upon a dark throne in the north, weighing in his malice all the tidings that came to him, and perceiving more of the deeds and purposes of his enemies than even the wisest of them feared, save only Melian, the queen. To her often the thought of Morgoth reached out, and there was foiled. And now again the might of Angband was moved, and as the long fingers of a groping hand, the forerunners of his armies probed the ways into Beleriand. Through Anak they came, and Dimbar was taken, and all the north marshes of Doriath. Down the ancient road they came that led through the long defile of Sirion, past the isle where Minas Tirith of Finrod had stood, and so through the land between Malduin and Sirion, and on through the eaves of Brethiel to the crossings of Teiglin. Thence the road went on into the guarded plain, but the orcs did not go far upon it as yet, for there dwelt now in the wild a terror that was hidden, and upon the red hill were watchful eyes of which they had not been warned. For Turin put on again the helm of Hador, and far and wide in Beleriand the whisper went, under wood and over stream, and through the passes of the hills, saying that the helm and bow that had fallen in Dimbar had arisen again beyond hope. Then many who went leaderless, dispossessed but undaunted, took heart again and came to seek the two captains. Dor Cuarthal, the land of bow and helm, was in that time named all the region between Teiglin and the west march of Doriath, and Turin named himself anew Gorthal, the Dread Helm, and his heart was high again. In Menegroth and in the deep halls of Nargothrond, and even in the hidden realm of Gondolin, the fame of the deeds of the two captains was heard, and in Angband also they were known. Then Morgoth laughed, for now by the dragon helm was Húrin's son revealed to him again, and ere long Amon Rúd was ringed with spies. In the waning of the year, Mim the dwarf and Ibun his son went out from Bar en Danwed to gather roots in the wild for their winter store, and they were taken captive by orcs. Then for a second time Mime promised to guide his enemies by the secret paths to his home on Amon Rud, but yet they sought to delay the fulfillment of his promise and demanded that Gorthol should not be slain. Then the orc captain laughed, and he said to Mime,
"Assuredly Túrin, son of Húrin, shall not be slain."
Thus was Bar en Danwed betrayed, for the orcs came upon it by night at unawares, guided by Mime. There many of Túrin's company were slain as they slept, but some fleeing by an inner stair came out upon the hilltop, and there they fought until they fell, and their blood flowed out upon the sirigon that mantled the stone. But a net was cast over Túrin as he fought, and he was enmeshed in it, and overcome, and led away. And at length, when all was silent again, Mime crept out of the shadows of his house, and as the sun rose over the mists of Sirion, he stood beside the dead man on the hilltop. But he perceived that not all those that lay there were dead, for by one his gaze was returned, and he looked in the eyes of Beleg, the elf. Then with hatred long stored, Mime stepped up to Beleg, and drew forth the sword Anglachel that lay beneath the body of one that had fallen beside him. But Beleg, stumbling up, seized back the sword and thrust it at the dwarf, and Mime in terror fled, wailing from the hilltop. And Beleg cried after him,
"The vengeance of the house of Hador will find you yet."
Now Beleg was sorely wounded, but he was mighty among the elves of Middle-earth, and he was moreover a master of healing. Therefore he did not die, and slowly his strength returned, and he sought in vain among the dead for Túrin to bury him. But he found him not, and then he knew that Húrin's son was yet alive, and taken to Angband. With little hope, Beleg departed from Amon Rud and set out northward towards the crossings of Teiglin, following in the track of the orcs. And he crossed over the Brithiak and journeyed through Dimbar towards the pass of Anak. And now he was not far behind them, for he went without sleeping, whereas they had tarried on their road, hunting in the lands and fearing no pursuit as they came northward. And not even in the dreadful woods of Tuor nu Fuin did he swerve from the trail, for the skill of Beleg was greater than any that have been in Middle-earth. But as he passed by night through that evil land, he came upon one lying asleep at the foot of the great dead tree, and Beleg, staying a steps beside the sleeper, saw that it was an elf. Then he spoke to him, and gave him lembas, and asked him what fate had brought him to that terrible place, and he named himself Gwyndor, son of Gwaelin. Grieving, Beleg looked upon him for Gwyndor was now but a bent and fearful shadow of his former shape and mood, when in the Nirnaeth Arnoediad that lord of Nargothrond rode with rash courage to the very doors of Angband, and there was taken. For few of the Noldor whom Morgoth captured were put to death because of their skill in forging and in mining for metals and gems, and Gwyndor was not slain, but put to labor in the mines of the north. By secret tunnels known only to themselves, the mining elves might sometimes escape, and thus it came to pass that Beleg found him, spent and bewildered, in the mazes of Tuor nu Fwyn. And Gwyndor told him that as he lay and lurked among the trees, he saw a great company of orcs passing northwards, and wolves went with them, and among them was a man whose hands were chained, and they drove him onward with whips. Very tall he was, said Gwyndor, as tall as are the men from the misty hills of Hithlum. Then Beleg told him of his own errand in Tuor nu Fwyn, and Gwyndor sought to dissuade him from his quest, saying that he would but join Turin in the anguish that awaited him. But Beleg would not abandon Turin, and despairing himself, he aroused hope again in Gwyndor's heart, and together they went on, following the orcs until they came out of the forest on the high slopes that ran down to the barren dunes of Anfauglith. There within sight of the peaks of Thangorodrim, the orcs made their encampment in a bare dell as the light of day was failing, and setting wolf sentinels all about, they fell to carousing. A great storm rode up out of the west, and lightning glittered in the shadowy mountains far away, as Beleg and Gwyndor crept towards the dell. When all in the camp were sleeping, Beleg took his bow, and in the darkness shot the wolf sentinels one by one and silently. Then in great peril they entered in, and they found Turin fettered hand and foot tied to a withered tree, and all about him knives that had been cast at him were embedded in the trunk, and he was senseless in a sleep of great weariness. But Beleg and Gwyndor cut the bonds that held him, and lifting him, they carried him out of the dell, yet they could bear him no further than to a thicket of thorn trees a little way above. There they laid him down, and now the storm drew very near. Beleg drew his sword Anglachel, and with it he cut the fetters that bound Turin. But fate was that day more strong, for the blade slipped as he cut the shackles, and Turin's foot was pricked. Then he was aroused into a sudden wakefulness of rage and fear, and seeing one bending over him with naked blade, he leaped up with a great cry, believing that orcs were come again to torment him. And grappling with him in the darkness, he seized Anglachel and slew Beleg Cuthalion, thinking him a foe. But as he stood, finding himself free and ready to sell his life dearly against imagined foes, there came a great flash of lightning above them, and in its light he looked down on Beleg's face. Then Turin stood stone still and silent, staring on that dreadful death, knowing what he had done. And so terrible was his face, lit by the lightning that flickered all about them, that Gwyndor cowered down upon the ground and dared not to raise his eyes. But now, in the dell beneath, the orcs were aroused, and all the camp was in a tumult, for they feared the thunder that came out of the west, believing that it was sent against them by the great enemies beyond the sea. Then a wind arose, and great rains fell, and torrents swept down from the heights of Túrin Turambar. And though Gwyndor cried out to Turin, warning him of their utmost peril, he made no answer, but sat unmoving and unweeping in the tempest beside the body of Beleg Cuthalion. When morning came, the storm was passed away eastward over Lothlan, and the sun of autumn rose hot and bright. But believing that Turin would have fled far away from that place, and all trace of his flight be washed away, the orcs departed in haste without longer search, and far off Gwyndor saw them marching away over the steaming sands of Anfauglith. Thus it came to pass that they returned to Morgoth empty-handed, and left behind them the son of Húrin, who sat crazed and unwitting on the slopes of Túrin Turambar, bearing a burden heavier than their bonds. Then Gwyndor roused Turin to aid him in the burial of Beleg, and he rose as one that walked in sleep, and together they laid Beleg in a shallow grave, and placed beside him Belthronding, his great bow that was made of black yew wood. But the dread sword Anglachel Gwyndor took, saying that it were better that it should take vengeance on the servants of Morgoth than lie useless in the earth, and he took also the lembas of Melian to strengthen them in the wild. Thus ended Beleg Strongbow, truest of friends, greatest in skill of all that harboured in the woods of Beleriand in the elder days, at the hand of him whom he most loved, and that grief was graven on the face of Turin and never faded. But courage and strength were renewed in the elf of Nargothrond, and departed from Túrin Turambar, he led Turin far away. Never once as they wandered together on long and grievous paths did Turin speak, and he walked as one without wish or purpose, while the year waned and winter drew on over the northern lands. But Gwyndor was ever beside him to guard him and guide him, and thus they passed westward over Sirion, and came at length to Ivrin, the springs whence Narok rose beneath the mountains of shadow. There Gwyndor spoke to Turin, saying,
Awake, Turin, son of Húrin Thalion. On Ivrin's lake is endless laughter. She is fed from crystal fountains, unfailing, and guarded from defilement by Ulmo, Lord of Waters, who wrought her beauty in ancient days.
Then Turin knelt and drank from the water, and suddenly he cast himself down, and his tears were unloosed at last, and he was healed of his madness. There he made a song for Beleg, and he named it Lair Cu Beleg, the song of the great bow, singing it aloud, heedless of peril. And Gwyndor gave the sword Anglachel into his hands, and Turin knew that it was heavy and strong and had great power, but its blade was black and dull, and its edges blunt. Then Gwyndor said,
This is a strange blade, and unlike any that I have seen in Middle-earth. It mourns for Beleg, even as you do. But be comforted, for I return to Nargothrond of the house of Finarfin, and you shall come with me and be healed and renewed. Who are you?
said Turin.
A wandering elf, a thrall escaped, whom Beleg met and comforted,
said Gwyndor.
Yet once I was Gwyndor, son of Gwaelin, a lord of Nargothrond, until I went to the Nirnaeth Arnoediad and was enslaved in Angband. Then you have seen Húrin, son of Galdor, the warrior of Dorlomin,
said Turin.
I have not seen him,
said Gwyndor.
But rumour of him runs through Angband that he still defies Morgoth, and Morgoth has laid a curse upon him and all his kin. That I do believe,
said Turin. And now they arose, and departing from Ivrin, they journeyed southward along the banks of Narok, until they were taken by scouts of the elves and brought as prisoners to the hidden stronghold. Thus did Turin come to Nargothrond.